Right.
Sorry.
Okay. Don't really need to introduce Dr. Dave because you already know him, and he's going to do us some of your latest river patterns, or no, current river patterns, because of
the ones that have been working just recently. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Killer river patterns.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Over to you. Thanks, Dave. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, John, for the invite again. I always love to come here and do this, and I'm really grateful for the invitation again. And great to see everyone, all familiar faces again this year. What I tend to do when I'm here is talk about the trout season that we've had so far, because we've had the first bit of the trout season, just about in perhaps the peak of it, the mayflies season. So right now, as we're speaking, there's clouds of mayfly coming off the River Lug as I drove up, and I think the trout are really going to start switching onto them in the next few days. And then obviously the season after that progresses into the summer and becomes much more diverse. So it's a really nice time to have a look at the season now and then have a bit of an idea of where it's going. So if you remember, last year when I was here, it couldn't have been any different to where we are this year. So I was here talking about the fact that it was only a couple of days beforehand that I'd been able to get into a river that wasn't flooded and actually catch some fish, but they were still quite muddy and quite a lot of heavy water going through. And I tied some big flies. I tied some river streamer patterns. I tied some big nymphs. And then a few dry flies that I thought might start working, but to be honest, I don't think I caught a fish in a dry fly by that stage. It's completely the opposite this year. So I'm going to be tying flies that have worked so far this year, and it's been pretty much dry flies from day one. It's been fantastic because we've had virtually no rain since the start of the trout season for all those weeks. The rivers some of the rivers that I fish up in Shropshire are lower than I've ever seen them before, even in the middle of summer, and they're really, really clear as well. So it's quite challenging. It's lovely weather to be out in. Unfortunately, the water temperature is still quite cold, so the fish are happy, but it's really challenging fishing. I mean, Ian, as well on the Oni we were just talking. So it's great to come here and just talk about a completely different trout season. So.
So you're getting a few mayflies coming up?
Yeah.
Round the Arrow, where I live, at Kingston,
yeah.
I haven't seen one.
Really?
And there used to be, because I've lived there up more or less all the time, every year there used to be clouds and clouds.
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't seen one.
Well, I mean, I was on the river last night, and there was a few mayflies around. Fish weren't really. The odd fish was taking one or two of them, but I couldn't really get one. About 3 nights before, I was out, and the fish really started feeding on them in the evening, just as they started to fall. I caught quite a few very quickly, but it didn't feel like it was in full swing. But tonight, just driving from Ludlow to Hereford, I don't know if you guys found it as well, but I was driving through clouds of mayfly down along the lug. So I think it's just about sort of really coming on.
One of them was on the screen, itching the lift coming in.
Yeah. But really, what I found, even up until last night, is what the fish are really on is the really small stuff, and that's really what you need to be using if you're going to have any success. So the first fly I'm going to tie is one that's probably caught more trout for me this season so far than anything else. And what it is, it's a midge imitation, and it's my sort of variation of a fly that Glenn Poynton developed called the Sipper, which has been made quite famous on social media. Most flies are you can't claim the originality for, but this is slightly different to his version. It's a smaller fly for a start, and it's much sparser, because I find that in these tricky conditions, when you've got really low water, it's much better. You get a much better reaction from the trouts, basically. So I've got a size 20 dry fly hook barbless dry fly hook in there. So
It has to be barbless.
it has to be barbless. Absolutely, yeah.
That's me out, Angela. You couldn't find a size 22.
I do have size 22s, but
So I can't see.
this is okay. And what I'm going to do here, I'm probably going to tie the equivalent of a size 24, 26 hook
I
fly.
can see the box and
Yeah.
believe size
Yeah.
22,
Yeah,
but don't ask me to see
Yeah.
the hook.
yeah, yeah. I know. And my eyesight's deteriorated since last year. I didn't need to use these last year, but now I can't tie a fly without them. So, especially small ones. So, it is a very small fly, but I like to use a size 20 hook just because a slightly bigger hook I think gives a little. Not only makes the tying a little bit easier, but it's.
When you tie really small like that, what thread do you use?
I'm using this is called the ultimate tying silk. So it's not a thread, it's a silk, and I pretty much use this for all my tying. You get this from Fish On Productions. This is their ultimate tying silk, and it comes in different colours, and it's what I use for pretty much everything apart from spider patterns, when I use the Pearsall silk and everything else. And the great thing about this is really, really strong. It's very, very thin, so you can really put multiple turns in without bulking. And another thing is you don't need to use varnish because it's so strong. I just never use varnish on my flies, and it just speeds up the process, but also helps not getting hackles and dubbing covered in varnish. So it often causes a bit of controversy, particularly with the fly tyers guilds, because a lot of my techniques are not really conventional. I'm one of those sort of fish catching fly tyers, so I like to tie flies pretty fast. I like to have boxes full of a few patterns, maybe just no more than 4 patterns, but loads and loads of them that I have confidence in, because you lose them, and I like to have them in different sizes, but not a big range of flies. So yeah, I don't usually use varnish because you don't need to with this silk. This is the olive version. It doesn't really matter, I think, for this fly what colour, but I do like to use the olive, and so does Glenn Poynton, who developed it. And now I'm going to use for the tail this sparkle thread, sparkle met it's called. Anything like sort of crinkle flash will do. It's just has to be a very, very thin one. And I'm just going to take a single strand of that. You can see how it has a nice sparkle. And I'm just going to tie that in. You could call this a tail, but I think it more represents like the trailing empty skin that you get from a hatching insect, or the shuck they call it, and it just gives a little bit of attraction in the water. And I'm not tying beyond at the very most halfway down that size 20 hook. I'm going to keep everything really short. So really, in actual fact, the size of that fly is probably more like the fly that would fill a size 26 or maybe even a 30 hook. And I don't think the fish really take any notice of the size of hook. I mean, I know people that tie very, very tiny flies on slightly bigger hooks than this, but they'll fish them as, for really tiny midges, and the fish seem to just respond to the actual sort of body materials. So I'll just cut that off, not too long, so it's just about to the end of the hook there. And then the next material, I'm going to take 2 select feathers, CDC feathers, and I'm looking for some quite small ones, and I also want some quite fluffy ones as well, so we get a really buoyant fly for the minimum bulk. So just get two natural CDC feathers, and then just line them up so they're both bending the same way. CDC feathers have a natural bend to them. I want these two feathers lined up in exactly so it forms just one wing ultimately. Just make sure it's all nicely lined up, and then you just want to pinch out the tip there, probably about 3.5 millimeters. And I'm just going to carefully pinch and loop that on to the front. A good idea at this point is just give 2 or 3 turns, not too tight, and then have a look at the fly and just inspect its proportions, because here's the chance for making any adjustments to the length of that wing. Now sometimes you might want it a bit longer, to make so it's a bit more visible, maybe in rougher water, but other times if you want it to be really subtle you might want to make it a bit small. But what I would say with this fly, and a lot of flies of this style, in my experience, is don't be too worried about having a long wing, even though it's a small fly, because when it's on the water that tends to sit upright, and it just helps you see the fly a bit better on the water, but it doesn't really seem to put the fish off. So don't be shy about having it fairly long.
So it's designed to with the hook bend down in the water and
Basically, three more turns or so, just very, very tight to lock that CDC in, and then with the waste parts of the stalk, I'm just going to cut that off, leaving a slight tag at the very end there. And then I'm going to add the final touch to this fly, which is a little bit of colour. I'm just using this dubbing, it's the Hen Spectra number 294. It's a nice bright orange colour, and I'm literally going to take one strand of this, just one strand of that. You don't really want any more. This is an extremely sparse and subtle fly. And I'm just going to dub that single strand there onto the silk, very sparsely, and then just tie that in as a thorax just over that CDC, and then pull the whole front wing back, and then put 6 or 8 turns just in front of that at the head ends, and it just cocks the CDC wing up a little bit to the right angle, and then it's a case of tying it off using a half hitch or a whip finish. I prefer using this method particularly on small flies because it allows you to get in and not disturb any of the materials. It's just as strong as any half hitch or any whip finish that you want. That's the finished fly. It's been a real fish catcher this year, particularly when you've got this really calm, very low flow water. It's been absolutely deadly, and caught
a minute tippet, no doubt.
I generally use a 0.10 tippet for this one, but it's a bit dodgy because this does really pull in the big fish as well. Caught my biggest fish this season on this, and I've been snapped a few times, to be honest with you. But you don't really want to use much of a thicker tippet really, because it affects the fly's movement on the water, and you want to minimise drag completely with this. So you could probably use a size 0.12 tippet, but it does look like a bit of tow rope on the water if you don't watch it. So
and fished on rivers particularly?
I've only used it on rivers, but I dare say this will work really well on stillwater trout when you've got really tricky conditions. In a similar way to that Delbury midge that we were talking about.
Yes, we were.
This will probably do exactly the same job and work on those really fussy trouts. Another thing to note about this fly is another famous tyer, Paul Proctor, has got a version quite similar to this, and his version he uses a white CDC wing, and he uses that because it just makes it more visible in the water. It is quite tricky to see this fly on the water in certain conditions. But
similar body material.
Yeah, I mean pretty similar design. It's more or less the same sort of design, but using the white CDC wing gives you a much more high vis version, and he reckons it doesn't make any difference to the fish, that colour. So that might be worth trying.
He uses when the fly goes like the shadows on the bank.
Yeah.
You can see it better.
You can see it better in the dark water. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, what I've been doing quite a lot of the time, when I'm fishing out, quite honestly, sometimes you can't see the fly in the water, so you've got to be pretty good, confident with your casting, so you know you've got a really good idea where your fly is. And I just strike at anything that rises in the vicinity, strike, and a lot of the time you end up with a fish on the ends, and if you don't have a fish on the end, it doesn't cost you anything, you know.
Yes, well, like simple flies with simple materials, but not too small.
You can tie this bigger, and I think the original Sipper midge is actually a bigger fly than this. I think it's a size 18 on a curved hook, so I've just scaled it down, but it is effective in larger sizes. Yeah. So staying on the same theme for the same conditions, there's another fly here that works really well when the fish are really tricky, when they're being really fussy, they're feeding on small stuff. The water's very low. This is another pattern that you can try in those same conditions. It's a slightly bigger fly. This one it's basically a take on a grey duster pattern, you know, which is perhaps for some people one of the most effective all-round river dry flies you can use.
Favourite.
I suppose the previous name of Sipper is perhaps the indication of the trout behaviour underneath.
That's exactly what it is. When they're sipping little tiny flies down, and it's really satisfying actually when you're fishing this fly and you just get this like little dimple and the fly's gone and you strike and then suddenly you're connected to a really big fish. It's often these small rises, these little dimples, you'll be surprised.
Really?
I mean the biggest one I caught this season.
Yeah.
No, the biggest one I caught this season, I'd have easily dismissed it as a little tiny trout par or something rising in the shallow water. I mean, really shallow water as well. And I cast to it, and fly just disappeared. And I thought it was just going to be a little. Anyway, it went off like a steam train.
Do you fish fluid or red?
Not very often, no.
You get that on fluid egg with flat cotton.
Yeah.
You like the tiny fly, and it'll disappear.
Yeah.
It's a glass of liquid.
Yeah.
You've got to think about 4 or 5 pounds on it.
Yes.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a slightly bigger hook now. It's a bit easier on the eyes, this one. I've got a 16 version, size 16 version of that dry fly hook. And I'm going to use the same silk, but this time in orange. a layer of silk on the hook. Okay, I'm just going to rest that silk about 2mm down behind the hook eye. And the first material I'm going to use is some ultra dry yarn. It's like a polypropylene yarn you use for floating posts on clink hammers and those sorts of things. And that's what I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to form a post. This stuff comes in quite a thick rope, so you need to separate out the strands to create the thickness that you want for your particular fly. For this particular one, I want quite a thin post. I don't really want a clink hammer style post. It's not really how I'm going to tie this fly and how the fly is going to work ultimately. And I'll show you how I like to tie the posts in. You can tie the strand in along the hook shank and then trim off the back, but I find a more efficient and neater way of doing it is to stretch out the material so you hold either end and you've just got the middle part of it sort of stretched out, and then you put that down onto the hook, and then a pinch and loop of the thread, lock it in with 3 turns, so you've got this equal tags at each end. And then what I do is I bring those 2 tags together and then hold that material up, and then I just go round with very, very tight turns around the base.
Do you tend to tie all your posts like that?
Most of the time these days, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a
There's loads of different methods.
there are. I mean, I do use the standard methods if I want to create, particularly on slightly bigger flies,
Yeah.
more clink hammer style, because that can then create that taper
Yeah.
quite nicely.
That helps, yeah.
But on small hooks, I tend to like this method. It's just a bit neater and a bit more efficient. So that sort of locks the post in, but it also creates a nice little base there for when you come in with the hackle. It just makes that process much easier. And when you've got quite a thin post, when you start winding your hackle, it's very hard to keep that post in the same position. So having a bit of thread reinforcing the base of it will make the hackling much easier and much neater. So we'll just leave that post over there at the moment, and then the next material is a bit of dubbing, and I'm going to choose to use some natural grey squirrel. You can use feather fibres. You can use a heron herl or a goose herl. I sometimes use those, but I tend to just use a bit of fine dubbing. So I'm going to take some of the fine part of the squirrel dubbing, so the underfur basically for the body. I don't want this to be too spiky. You'll notice also that I'm actually working from the eye of the hook backwards, which is in reverse of what you normally do, and you'll see why I do that in a minute. So I'm just going to dub that on fairly sparsely. I don't want this to be a really bulky body. And as I say, I'm going to dub this body from top to bottom as opposed from bottom to top. So just starting just behind the eye, go round the post, and you can create that slightly bulgy thorax profile at this point, and then you can gradually taper by using ever increasing open turns of the dubbing thread to form the rest of the body, and then just pinching out any excess. And then this is the reason why I've gone in that direction, because another great advantage of this silk thread, it forms very, very good ribbing material. Because it's so strong, it's as strong as any wire ribbing that you might use, but it's lightweight and allows you to sort of really minimise the amount of weight on this fly, which is always a good thing for dry flies that you want sat in the surface. So I'm simply just going to come back up over that body in open turns, creating the rib. And I'm just going to finish just in front of the post. Okay, so that's the body of the fly. It's a very, very simple way of tying, but I find it's really effective, keeping the materials to a minimum.
I was going to ask why you use the orange thread when you've covered it up with the body dubbing.
It's a good question. You can use other colours. I like orange because I think natural insects tend to have an orange coloration to them. You know, the body, and it tends to be quite attractive to the fish. So having that orange sort of shining through, I just think
contrast
gives a bit. I mean, I find if you could use a black thread, but black will just darken the whole fly. Yellow can be quite good, particularly with sort of olive patterns, lighter olive patterns. I personally I like orange thread for quite a lot of my dry flies, to be honest with you. Just because if you look at a lot of flies on the rivers, they tend to have a sort of orangey tinge to them.
I believe you.
I'm just going to choose a hackle fibre. Now this is just a standard grizzle cape. It is worth getting yourself a good quality one for these flies, because a good quality hackle does make a difference to the fly's performance when it's on the water. Just size that up. That is perfect. Just pinch off the excess hackle from the bottom of the stalk. You don't really want to be using hackle too far down the stalk, because the fibres aren't as stiff, and also that stalk is very, very thick. What I'm going to do with this hackle is I'm going to actually attach it to the hook sort of upside down. And the reason I'm doing that is that when I actually finish this fly off, I end up pulling the hackle forward, and with the fibres slightly curved upwards, it just gives a much better profile to the fly. Just tie that in quite tightly at the side of the post. Trim off the excess stalk. And what I tend to do at this point is just put a little bit more dubbing in there, only a tiny little bit, just to cover that hackle stalk and that bit of thread that I've put in. And it just enhances the thorax region of the fly. Just a couple of turns and it just disguises that thread a little bit more. Okay, this is often the tricky bit with these flies, but you'll see the benefits of tying the post in the way I've just described at this point when I'm actually putting the hackle in. So it's a case of just putting one turn in around post, holding it in place really tightly, because that first turn tends to be really crucial in terms of making sure the post doesn't just collapse. And once you've done that, you can then start to wind with a bit more confidence. What I'm doing is I'm making each successive hackle turn go underneath the previous one. So you're putting every turn in as close to the base as possible. A little technique for doing that can help is just pulling the post backwards as you're turning the hackle forwards, and then as you come round the back of the fly, pull the post slightly forwards, and it just pulls everything up slightly and just allows you to put in the next turn without interfering with the previous one. You don't need more than about 4 or 5 turns of a decent hackle on this one. That's 5 turns, I think. And then I'll just tie that hackle off just by following exactly the same route that the hackle stalk has just taken with the tying thread, and then making sure that thread sits right under those hackle fibres so you don't trap them too much. So 3 or 4 good turns of the threads will secure that hackle in place, and then you can just trim off the excess underneath. And there you've got quite a nice fly that you might describe as a paraduster. You could trim that post off and leave it, and that could be a really, really effective fly. But for this version, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that post and all the hackle I've just done forwards, and this is why it's called a para loop, and then tying that off tightly just at the eye of the hook. Could do with tightening that bobbin up a little bit. Can be a bit tricky, as you can see. Okay. And then before trimming off the excess, it's a good idea at this stage to put your whip finish in, or use your half hitch tool like I do, just to slip that in underneath that post. Because if you start trying to trim that post at this stage, quite often the thread will jump off and the whole hackle will jump out, and you have to go through that whole process again. And trim off the thread, and then you can just work on trimming the excess off the front of the fly. You can, I suppose, leave a bit of the post sticking out, and it looks a bit like a crippled midge pattern that you might use on a still water, like a hatching buzzer. Or you can trim it like a traditional para loop pattern and just get rid of it entirely. I tend to go for the shorter option. It doesn't matter if there's a little bit sticking out. It'll help the buoyancy of the fly as well. So you end up with a fly that's different to a parachute, because everything has been pulled forward, and it just gives the fly a slightly different attitude and profile when it's in the water. And it's a very, very effective fly in a lot of conditions, but particularly when you're fishing tricky low water in the summer.
So that'll sit back a bit in the water.
Yeah. It's one of those flies that if you're not really sure what the fish are feeding on, you've tried a few things and you're not getting a response, either this one or the one I just tied previously, that midge, you tend to find they just suddenly, that they're the answer, that just gets unlocks the key very often. Not always. I mean, there's other flies that you need to use.
You get more hookups.
Yeah, that's another good point actually. Yeah. I mean, it's not the prettiest dry fly. I mean, I know there's people that tie dry flies, lovely hackle dry flies, and they look great. and they work really, really well. But a lot of my flies, I like to have them as functional as possible. So like you say, I'm thinking about hookup rates and making sure you use the gape of the hook, because when you're actually out on the river, that makes a big difference. And I find often with those stiff hackled dry flies, traditional size ones, I just don't find them as effective, and they're not as effective as traditional dry fly hooks in actually setting the hook and holding the fish when they're on. So that's a good point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Visiting tyres page.
Have you dispensed with the Dr. Dave's unique tying off that you expounded at Muslow one time? You said that when you started you didn't have an idea how to tie off. I was always been fascinated by the technique that you adopted.
Yeah, I do use that on most of my flies actually. That it was a really experienced fly tyer showed me that when I was a kid, and he said actually this is an easier version to do a wick finish, and I've just stuck with it.
Well, yeah,
it
works.
Yeah. But I tend to use this tool on the smaller hooks,
well,
and when there's hackles and things. And this method, I have to say, I learned this when I was a kid as well. When I went to the West Midlands Game Fair as a young lad, there was a chap there tying flies, and his name was Tom Saville. I don't know if you remember Tom Saville, but he was quite a well-known stillwater fly fisherman.
Yeah.
And he used to run a fly tying company, didn't he?
Yes.
Saville's. Anyway, he was there, and he was sat in a tent tying some flies, and I just, he was a very friendly guy, and he was showing me a few flies, and I just spent a bit of time sat next to him, and he showed me this technique. He says, don't bother about whip finishes and all those sorts of things, just get yourself a biro, and he just used a big biro, took the middle out, and he just used this method, and he said it works just as well, and it helps you put it over the front of the fly.
I found a set of those in my fly boat.
Yeah.
I ain't got a clue what they were.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
for what.
Yeah.
But what the hell are these brassets
Yeah,
for?
yeah. And so from that young age, I just started using it. And I used to be using my school pens, and I've just stuck with it. So right, so it's mayfly season, as we said. They seem to be out in force tonight.
Question: do you use a mayfly in mayfly season?
I do. If the fish are feeding on them, obviously, then I absolutely do. But if the fish are not feeding on them, sometimes you do get you get hatches of mayfly. The mayfly around some evenings the fish
catch one on the mayfly, use a black fly.
Yeah, quite often that's the case. I mean, sometimes the fish just decide not to take the mayfly, and they're feeding, and that's when this fly comes in. Almost 99% of the time, if there's mayfly around and the fish are feeding on something but they're ignoring mayflies, that's where I'll stick that on, and most of the time it works. Most of the time, that's the sort of thing that after They tend to like the either a big mayfly or they're on the really, really tiny stuff. Unless there's a hatch of some other olive species, when they might sort of lock onto those. So if they're around, then maybe use one of those patterns. But this is another. I've got a couple of really kind of strange looking mayfly patterns that I use, and the Ludlow guys will know this really well. It's like what I call the easy tie mayfly, and the version I've tied before and I use mostly is essentially a spinner pattern, which imitates the spinner phase of the mayfly's life cycle. So when they come down in the evening, this will be the one to use. But there is another version of it, which you can use when the mayfly duns are about. So during the hatch of mayflies, which tends to be earlier in the afternoon, I've got a version of the easy mayfly, which is the easy dun. So I'll demonstrate that now. But it's good to have the two in your box. So I've got size 12 dry fly hook on. It's the same model, just a slightly bigger one. And I meant to say this earlier, but when I'm tying dry flies, you'll notice I tend to have the hook angled slightly up in the vise. The reason I do that is I find that when you get towards the end of the tying, there's nothing worse than when you've got your hackles on or you've got your wing materials on. It's very easy for the thread to jump off the front of the fly when you're tying dry flies, which is extremely frustrating. And I find that if I just angle that hook slightly up, it just helps prevent that happening. So I do that pretty much on all my dry flies. I do the complete opposite on nymphs, as I demonstrated last year. So if I'm using a bead head nymph, what I'll do is I'll actually put the bead in the hook, and then I'll turn the hook point down, because then it keeps the bead stuck to the end, because there's nothing worse than when you're tying a nymph having the bead sliding up and down the hook shank. And I know some people super glue and all that, but I never really use that. It just adds more time to your tying, and you don't really need it if you can secure that bead nice and tight with the materials. So I'm using black thread for this one, and the reason I'm using black thread is that it just enhances the sort of the colour that I'm trying to imitate of this mayfly. So we'll just add a layer of thread to the hook and form a good base of this thread, because it's we need quite a good gripping surface for the materials that I'm going to use. You can actually put a little dab of glue on the shank at this point. Sometimes I do that actually, just a really little small dab of super glue before I put the next material on it, and it just then means that everything just sort of sticks to the hook and doesn't start spinning around. But I'm going to do it without the glue tonight, and hopefully I'm not going to make a complete mess of it. So the next material, which forms the main part of the body of this mayfly, is a chenille, and it's like an ultra fine chenille. This is 2 millimeters in diameter, and this one is a cream colour. If I can find the packet, this is the brand and the specifications if you're interested. Just going to take just over an inch long piece of the chenille, and then starting just a few millimeters behind the eye of the hook, I'll introduce the chenille to the top side of the hook, and then a pinch and loop, just secure that in with a couple of loose turns, and then, as I say, because we don't want this chenille slipping and sliding around the hook shank, it's a good idea, particularly if you haven't used any glue on the hook, just to put in a few really tight turns there. And because I'm using this very powerful and very thin silk, I can really put some strength into it, and the silk really doesn't bulk up, so you can really make a very strong connection there. And then I'm just going to do wide open turns down the body to the end point, and then I'm going to, and that is around about in line with the hook point, so not quite to the end of the hook, but sort of 3/4 down. And then at that end point I'm going to put in several very, very tight as I dare, turns of silk. And you can put quite a few in here because A, this is a big fly, and B, that the silk is so fine that it doesn't bulk up that easily, but that gives a really secure hold. So trim off at the front, leaving a little tuft there because that will start to form the impression of the head when I get to the end. And then this forms a nice detached body section. So to finish that off, I'm just going to singe the end of that chenille because that will then seal it up nicely and also create a nice end taper profile to the fly. Give it a couple of seconds and then give it a good pull. And then you get this tapered profile and you get a little tail, ready-made tail sticking out. Because you'll notice it's a mayfly pattern, I'm not using a tail on this fly. The reason is they're really fiddly, they take ages. Second reason is the fish just don't care. It makes no difference at all to what the fish see on the surface of the water, and quite often the natural mayflies are not perfect specimens. They have tails missing. I don't think it's a main trigger feature for the trout, so I'm kind of this is a stripped down pattern. You know, this is the sort of the most minimalistic mayfly you can probably ever use. So it's quick and easy to tie because you tend to lose a lot of them in the trees and all that. But also going back to the point that someone made with the previous fly about functionality on the water, this is the mayfly that gives the best hookup rates. I find that with a lot of the traditional mayfly patterns, either the bodies are too stiff or the tails are too long, and so many times the fish come up behind it and they just push the fly away, and you don't get very good hookup rates. What I've got here is a very, very loose detached tail. It gives maximum coverage of the hook gape, and when a trout comes up behind it, it's very soft, it collapses. Probably feels more natural to the fish, so you get a more positive take. But you do get it, particularly in combination with this dry fly hook here, this particular model of dry fly hook, you do get a very good hookup rate and a very good holding rate of the fish. So it all adds up to more fish, more fish in your returns box at the end of the day. Okay, so the second part of this complicated tying is a hackle, and I'm going to use a grizzle hackle. Just select one of the right length. It's quite tempting with mayflies to have really, really big hackles, really long hackles, because they are quite a big insect, but I tend to find if you use anything much longer than that,
just for the gape.
Just for the gape.
Yes.
Yeah. You don't need to go any more than that. And the way I'm going to tie this, I'm actually use this as a palm ring, so that gives plenty of bulk to the fly. That gives the illusion of bulk. It's a big insect, but rather than just having this as a single hackle at the front, the palm ring gives that illusion of bulk without having to use a big hackle. But part of the reason I use a not too long a hackle is I find that it helps the floatability. If you use hackles that are too long, they tend to get waterlogged a bit more easily. They tend to take longer to dry out, and they tend to sort of flop on the surface. Whereas if you use slightly shorter hackles, you tend to get a much better buoyancy of the fly, and they don't tend to get waterlogged that quickly. So I'm just going to tie in that hackle tightly again near the end of the fly, and then I'm just going to create a palm ring back up the fly with this hackle. As I say, it's a big fly, and it's unlike the other flies I've tied. It does need to be quite a bulky fly to really get the fish's attention and interest. And for those of you on YouTube, this is genuine live music. This is not a soundtrack.
We had to pay a lot extra for this.
This is where it gets quite lively. So I'm just tying that hackle off there at the front, and I'm just going to pull the front part back and just neaten up that head. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pull all the hackles from the upper half, just pinch those quite tightly so they stick up, and then I'm going to go in with the scissors and I'm just going to trim off those hackle fibres on the underside. So what that does, it just means the fly sits in the water, always in the same position, but it also makes it just sit in the water as opposed to on top of the water.
And does it tend to flop on the side and
Well,
damaged mayfly?
It can do. Part of the reason I've trimmed the hackles underneath is so that when I cast it sits on the water pretty stably every time. I mean, like you say, there are advantages to allowing it to move around. It's up to you really. You can do it both ways. I tend to like it sitting like that on the water, but I'm going to put another hackle in actually that's going to give it a little bit of movement. So with the spinner pattern that I tie, this is it basically. It's just a chenille body, and it's a clipped palmed hackle, because that then will sit with the profile of a spinner. If you can imagine a mayfly spinner with its wings spread out. If you look at that fly from underneath, it does have that illusion, and the spinner pattern obviously wants to sit quite still because they tend to just float down the river in that one position, whereas the duns tend to be more lively, like you say. So I'm going to put a yellow dyed English partridge feather in. So just prepare the feather in the usual way with this, as you would with any soft hackle fly, by creating that V tying in point. And then what I'm going to do with this hackle is similar to the Paraloop grey duster. I'm actually going to make sure I tie that hackle in upside down. Now, for those of you who know the jingler dry fly, this is the style that is used for the jingler, tying in the partridge hackle upside down, so the hackle points will end up sitting forward, and it just gives the fly that bit of extra movement, and it rather than the hackle lying back against the body of the fly, just gives it a little bit more lively attitude. So I'm just tying that in front of the grizzle hackle. Trim off the excess. And I'm just going to put a few turns of this partridge hackle in at the very front there, just in front of the grizzle. It's a good idea to sweep back the fibres with each turn. You can always moisten your fingers for this bit here. Make sure you don't trap any of those lovely leggy fibres. Easier said than done. And then cross the thread with a couple of turns. And then you can then secure everything by coming the other way and locking that hackle down. Trim off the stalk. Trim off any excess. Making sure that the eye is nice and clean. Nothing worse on an evening as the darkness is falling and you're putting a new fly on and you're trying to get the line through the eye of the hook and there's something in there that's blocking it and the fish are rising and
Frustration.
you get, yeah.
Is it the partridge that differentiates it as a gun?
That's a good question, and I think that is the answer, I think.
Yeah.
I think there's two things really. The two differences between this version and the spinner version that I bored everybody with many times in the past is the colour. So we've got a cream body, we've got the yellow partridge feather, so it gives it the colour illusion that a dun has as opposed to the creamy white and dark that the spinner has. That's the first thing. But then the second thing is exactly that. This partridge feather at the front gives that lively appearance. It allows the fly to move around a bit on the surface. So it's not just sat there locked into the surface film like the other pattern is. This actually moves around a bit.
And it looks more leggy.
It looks more leggy. It looks more like the duns that just hatch. So yeah, that's the main difference.
Very good.
I mean, it's an embarrassingly simple fly because mayflies are often the pride of fly tyers. But in terms of effectiveness, this is what I like. The other good thing about them is you can treat this with various floatants.
Yeah.
And you can actually really so what I'll do with this pattern is once I've tied it, I'll give it a treatment of this this watershed. So I'll show you what I do. So
you do that the night before.
Yeah. So once I've tied a few of these, you don't need much of it, just a few drops, and then you can use your fingers to work that through all the fibres, and you can soak the chenille body in it. So the whole fly is really soaked in that watershed material. Now you need to leave that for 24 hours to properly dry out, and that means you've got a really nice waterproof coating. When you're out on the river, what you can do is use mucilin. This is what Derek recommended. And actually use mucilin to smear the detached body, and it just keeps it nice and prevents, cause the chenille does get waterlogged quite quickly, doesn't it? And you have to make sure you dry it out. The mucilin method's
A
really good.
little jar of clear mucilin
Yeah,
with
yeah.
an indentation.
Yeah.
You just take the lid off, pop it,
Yeah.
put the lid on, turn it upside down,
Oh, right.
and it drains out and you just let it sit on the side for 24 hours.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So just the body is going to sit there, but with the partridge, it's going to sort of elevate the head.
Yes.
Try
Yeah.
emerging
Yeah.
down. So, yeah.
That's the idea. Yeah.
The trouble is with the small ones, they take it down. Yeah. I've had quite a
Very
few.
accomplished. Well done. Despite it was a 12,
Yes.
Without damage.
yeah.
Do you know?
You okay, Dave? Yeah, you're all
We're out
right.
for time.
Yeah.
Good.
Did you want to break?
Yeah. Do you want to take a break?
It's up to you. The problem with the break is you get drawn into conversation.
You
It's
do.
very
You do.
difficult
You do.
to draw it back again.
I've got one or two I can carry on with. So I'm happy to carry on. Then we can
Okay.
we'll have a break
That's
after that.
probably the best.
Yeah. Good. I mean, if you're bored and fed up, just let me know.
Oh, no,
I can go on. I can go on all day, all night with these.
I'm going on.
As these guys know.
On all night. Question, so you're sat down to tie flies of an evening or whenever you
Yeah.
do it. How many would you tie? And, I mean, I'm assuming you would tie one pattern and bang out so many because it just makes sense.
I tend to.
So how many do you tend to tie per session before your eyes go or you
Oh gosh.
that's
I can do quite long sessions if I want to, but I can sit for hours at the
just
vice.
depending on how much time you've got basically.
I mean, during lockdown, for example,
Yeah.
when I couldn't go out fishing, I would tie hundreds in the day.
Really?
Yeah. And, but these days, I normally tend to, because I've got all the flies I kind of need. So it's more about making sure that if I know a certain fly is working, or I've had really success with a certain fly in a certain condition, I'll go home and the next day I'm just obsessed with it. So recently it's been this midge pattern, because that's worked so well this season, more so than previous. So I thought I need to make sure I've got loads of that in my box when I go out. So I'll tie 12 of those in one go, and I'll go out to the river. And if I've got 12 in my box, I'm happy. But if I've got fewer than that, I tend to panic about if I start losing them and am I going to get caught short. As a rule, I tend to always, in the box I take out fishing with me, which is not all my flies. It's like a little chest
I
pack.
try to limit what I take
and
now, just one box.
Yeah. And I tend to keep things in the car. So if conditions change, or you realise you think you needed a fly that you haven't got, and you can always go back to your car and just top up your. But I don't really carry a lot of stuff on the bank with me. But I like to have minimum six of each pattern, absolute minimum, just to make sure that I don't run out of anything. So I tend to tie in sixes, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Right.
If I'm looking to keep everything up to date.
Yeah.
66.
Yeah. Both. Yeah, it is.
Okay, another very handy dry fly that works well throughout the hot summer months, and have had success with this already in the season, actually, including last night. I'm going to move on to the olive spinners. So in these late evenings after hot days, you tend to get a lot of olive spinners descending on the water, and the fish really do switch onto these. quite often you'll see fish rising very, very vigorously to something, but you can't actually see anything on it. What you think, well, you know, there's no obvious duns or flies you can see. And quite often it could be the small midges, but if the fish are really rising in a frenzy, it tends to be spinners lying flat on the surface, so you can't really see them, but they are there, and the fish know they're there. So this is a fly for those conditions. Problem I have with a lot of these spinner patterns is that a lot of them tend to be flat profile flies, like completely flat, so they sit lovely on the water, but the problem I have is I can't see the buggers very easily. So this is a slightly handy visible spinner pattern.
That's a grub hook now.
It's a grub hook, yeah. It's a fine wire curved hook. It's a size 16, this one. I do tie this in smaller sizes, or you can tie it in bigger sizes as well. But size 16 is a good all-round size, I think, for this particular spinner pattern, which, you know, it tends to be a blue-winged olive spinner. But the different sizes of hooks you can use for any olive spinners, but it tends to be the blue-winged olives that are the main species. And they have started to appear actually recently in this hot weather. Okay, so the thread I'm going to use is the orange tying silk that I used previously with the grey duster. So just put a layer of that onto the hook. That's worth saying. You can use a straight hook on this one. It seems a bit weird perhaps to use a curved hook for a spinner pattern, because spinners tend to like quite flat. But I just like the way that this this gives a bit of a curve, so when it's sat in the water you just get that bit of body hanging into the water, which helps it grip the surface. But whether it is genuinely effective or not, I don't know, but I just seem to find that I have more success with the slightly curved version than the straight ones. I'm going to use a post. So I was saying about spinner patterns being, you know, you use them in the evening. There's often a problem with visibility. Has driven me crazy loads of times in the past when I've not been able to see the fly and I've missed loads of takes. So I'm going to put a post in purely as a sight. It's got nothing to do with imitative qualities for this fly. It's purely a functional, but I find really helpful. And the reason I'm using this chartreuse colour is that it's the best colour for visibility when the light fades in the evening. You know, that almost glows. It's like a little light on the water. Orange is great during the day, but orange tends to fade very quickly at night, whereas this one you can see it quite clearly right into almost the darkness. So I'm going to do a similar thing to previous. I'm just going to separate the yarn so I've got the right thickness that I want.
About a quarter, is it?
It's about a quarter, yeah, for this particular brand. That's probably about a quarter. I'm going to use the same tying in methods. Sort of tying it like a bow tie, I suppose, onto the hook 3 turns, and then bring it together, and then 3 or 4 very tight turns at the base. To lock it in and form that base for the hackle. And exactly the same as with that paraloop duster pattern, I'm going to hackle this one from top to bottom as well, and then use the thread again as a rib to come back up through the body. It tends to be the standard technique I use for these sorts of flies. As far as the body's going, I'm going to use a very, very fine dubbing. These are all fine dry fly dubbings. I'm going to use this one in a red colour, which forms quite a nice.
Is that poly yarn?
It's like poly yarn. It's very fine. Yeah. You can use red, you can use orange. The blue-winged olive spinners tend to have that reddy orange, rusty colour. I quite like using this red. I don't think it probably really makes a difference when it's sat on the surface, particularly in the fading light. But I do find this one really effective. So I'm just dubbing that. Down the body of the fly. And if you put too much on, just pinch what you don't need off, and then you can then neaten that up. And come back up the body with your open turns, forming the rib. And just leave that just in front of the post. Just make sure that body's nice and neat. And again, I've not used tails on this pattern. I mean, spinners do have tails. They tend to have those long tails, but they tend to have taken a bit of a bashing. So quite often spinners on the surface have got missing wings, missing legs, missing tails. And I don't really think it makes any difference to the fish whatsoever. So I've purely just got rid of them. One version that I do tie sometimes is adding a little bit of the crystal flash that I used earlier. Remember that crinkle crystal? You can perhaps add a couple of strands of that at the end there, just to give it a little bit of flash. If that you know, want to make it a little bit more sparkly. Yeah,
in a V or something.
Just in like a V. Yeah. It might just make it a little bit more attractive to the fish. So you can always do that. But I tend to avoid these long tails coming out the back on this pattern. Okay, now it's time for the hackle, and I'm just going to use a blue dun cock hackle. So that's a dyed hackle in the blue dun colour. Just pull off those lower fibres that you don't want. Tie that in right next to the base of the post. Again, 3 or 4 really tight turns to secure that in, trim the waist, and then as before just get a little tiny bit of dubbing, very tiny amount, and just use that just to fill in that gap that you've created by those turns of thread, just so it maintains that profile of the thorax and doesn't leave any bare thread. And then I'm not going to tie this hackle with a parachute style here. I'm going to actually wind it the normal way. and you'll see why I'm doing that in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the back of the post first of all, and I want 3 overlapping turns of hackle right behind the post, and then I come in front of the post and I put 3 turns of hackle in front of the post, and it's a case of just tying off that hackle. Trim off the excess, get rid of any stray fibres that you don't want. Just going to finish off with my whip finish at the front. Trim off the threads, and then I'm going to trim that post so it's just the same length as those hackle fibres are in terms of the height of them. Okay, so that just sits there in those hackle fibres, and then in exactly the same way that I tied the mayfly spinner that I talked about earlier, and also the palmwood hackle and the mayfly dun that I just did, I'm going to trim off all the fibres on the underside of that fly, and that will give it the profile of the spinner. You can use a parachute style for this, but I find that for this spinner pattern, what you get here is much better illusion of 2 wings that are sticking out at the side. Plus, with all that hackle above there, you get better buoyancy of the fly, and it sits nice in the water. And there's a third reason as well. Some of these spinner patterns have those wings that stick out at the side, so you can have sort of polypropylene yarn or feather fibres forming wings at the side. The problem I have with those is that when you're casting, they tend to spin in the air and tangle you know, kink up your leader. So this is also designed to be more aerodynamic, and when it lands in the water, it just sits in the right place every time. And especially when you're fishing at night, you know, you put this out and you can that post just lands like that, it comes down. Hopefully a fish will take it. I caught quite a few fish on this last night actually. It seems to be the best pattern. So that's a size 16 version, but if the fish are being quite tricky, what I'll do is, first of all, I'll just scale down and use a smaller version, so maybe a size 18. It's amazing how that can often make the difference before changing to, you know, a completely different type of pattern. Just scale it down a size.
Okay, last one.
Last one, yeah. I'll do one more. So we've covered the midges. We've covered some of the sort of generic olives with the grey paraloop duster. We've done a mayfly. We've done an olive spinner. So I'm going to move on to the other main flying insect group that the trouts feed on. That's the caddis flies. So I might have done this fly here before. I've definitely done it at Ludlow, I think. But this is a really effective caddis pattern that I tend to use an awful lot when they're about. Usually a bit later in the summer, but it can be really effective at any time really when the fish are on the surface. And I've lost my orange thread.
It's right in front of you. Under your tray. That's it. Are those bobbin holders from Fish On as well?
No, these are Stonfo bobbin holders.
Okay.
So you can get these from loads of places. They're about £20 each, and
is that a weight on around the top there, hexagonal like that?
It's just like
Tensioning devices.
the tensioning device is here. Like it's like
does that add weight to it?
It does a bit, yeah.
Okay.
I think they do these in 3 sizes. I think there's a very small lightweight version.
Okay.
No, they're 2 sizes. Sorry, was it 3? They do a red version, a black version, and a blue version. The blue version is actually the biggest, and it's mostly used for tying larger flies, salmon flies, and pike flies. I just prefer to use a bigger bobbin, so that's why I'm using this one. But probably most people who try these sorts of flies will go for the red version, which is the medium size. But anyway, I use the blue without any problem. The hook is a size 16 dry fly hook. This fly you can tie in sizes from, I tend to tie it from size 12 maximum down to size 18. So it works well in a range of sizes. Size 16 is probably the most useful, I find, for the sorts of species that we get on the Shropshire rivers. So orange tying silk. This is going to be a sort of semi-detached style fly, so I'm only covering the hook halfway down the shank approximately with the thread, because I'm not really going to be working on anything beyond that. And the first part is to form the body, and it's going to be I have in the past called this a semi-detached caddis, I think, and this is the reason why. So the body I'm going to use some fine polypropylene dubbing. This one has actually got flecks of UV in it as well, gives it a bit of extra attraction. I quite like that idea. Whether it makes a big difference to the fish or not, I don't know. It might do in certain light conditions. So what I'm doing, I'm going to actually form my own detached body from the dubbing. So I'm just going to take a strand of that, and I'm going to roll it out into a string with my finger and thumb. So with this fine dubbing, you can really, it's quite malleable. So pull it out into a string, and then I'm going to twist it in opposite directions with my finger and my thumb, and it starts to create like a kink in the body, so that will form my detached body.
You double it over.
Yeah, if you just turn it in opposite directions, and it naturally like winds up on itself.
What colour is that?
It's a good question. It's like a cream colour. I think that's probably the nearest to describe it. I haven't got the original packet for this one. I think this came from what looked like a bit of a dodgy site on eBay. It was definitely from China. It took about 2 months to come, but it was really cheap. And I think it was called laser dry fly dubbing, and it ended up coming on a container ship from China, I think it was. And it didn't have much of a description to it, but I just love the colour. I think it was described as tan or cream. But if you go on eBay and look for dry fly laser dubbing, you'll probably find a version of it there. I've got a black one as well.
All the same jobs on Chinese sites.
Yeah, it was dead cheap. I mean, it was dead cheap, but it took about 2 months to arrive. I just completely forgotten I ordered it, and then suddenly I got this package through, and oh wow.
Forgot you ordered it.
But it does work fantastic for this this detached body. I hope they still do it, because I don't know what I'll do when I run out of it. So,
You'll have to buy it. You've got a lifetime supply there.
yeah. So what I've done, I've formed that twisted rope, and I've just tied that in as a little sort of semi-detached body. Then I'm just going to lock that down to around about, or not quite halfway down the shank. Okay. Now this was actually developed from, I think this pattern originated in Poland. I think it was the competition anglers in Poland that introduced this fly style to the UK, and I think I just picked it up by looking at an image on Instagram or something of what they called the Polish competition caddis. So it's not one of my original flies. It's just one I've sort of copied and picked up and adapted. So it does originate from Poland. And for the body of the fly, I'm going to use grey squirrel dubbing. So just dubbing that from bottom to top as normally.
One rabbit to a suitable substitute.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you could use rabbit, you could use hare. Up to you really. I do like my squirrel because you've got a real nice mix of spiky fur, and then you've got this softer under fur if you want to use that. I really like squirrel dubbing. I use it a lot. And then for the wing, I'm going to use a couple of CDCs.
Looks like you've pre-sized those, have you?
Well, perhaps I should have done. I mean, they have been hand selected already, but if I had more time, I would probably grade these into different sizes, so I wouldn't have to go digging around every time I tie a fly. But I always buy the premium quality CDC when I'm tying dry flies. I think it's worth the extra money. The slightly cheaper stuff is quite frustrating because you tend to find it really difficult to get a nice fibre, and then when you're actually using it, it does make a difference. Good quality CDC makes a big difference, I think, with the performance of the fly. So in the size 16 version, I'll use 2 CDC feathers, just line them up so they're back to back as before. Very important to have them exactly lined up, tip to tip. And just pinch those plume tips out to the length you want. So the length I want here is just a little bit longer than the end of the hook shank. Just about to where that detached body pokes out. So, good steady pinch and loop. 2 loose turns of thread, and then you can just sit back and just inspect the proportions there. I think that's about right. You could always just squeeze it backwards and forwards if you want to make it longer or shorter. But that'll do, I think, for this one. So now I'll lock it in. So 3 or 4 very strong turns of silk locks that in. and then I'll just trim off the excess at the front. A couple more turns just to create a bit more space between the wing and the eye, because I'm going to finish this fly off with some more squirrel dubbing at the front. Some people might use a hackle at the front of the fly, that's fine, but I tend to use spiky squirrel dubbing to create that sort of illusion of legs and movement at the front of the fly.
Could you substitute that with rabbit?
You can do, yeah.
That's quite good, isn't it?
Yeah, you can use rabbit or hare just as well. So squirrel's my preference, just because you can get some nice spikier bits, I suppose, and there's more of a range. I think it's very useful because there's more of a range of soft and spiky fur on a squirrel compared to some of the other types of fur. So be quite generous with this. Don't be afraid to put a good wad of this on, because when you're dealing with spiky squirrel it tends to fall off anyway. I don't bother waxing the thread, I've just sort of moistened it slightly, so you might get, particularly with the spiky parts of the dubbing, it can be a bit tricky to stick it all on, so give yourself plenty, and you want a nice good spiky front to this fly anyway, so just wind that gently just in front of the wing.
I wouldn't have thought that would go.
There we go, you can just easily remove excess. I tend to put a bit more on than I might need, just so I don't get any bald patches when I finish the fly. And then you can just pull those fibres back, just like you would do with a hackle, to create the head. And then again, this tool is absolutely invaluable for this style of fly, because I can go in and just push those fibres back and create a very small, very neat head, and make sure the eye of the hook is clean.
I'm amazed you could put that amount of dubbing on that 1 millimetre of shank.
The way to do it is to use the really spiky fur, but use a lot of it, but don't squeeze it too tightly. So you will get a lot falling off, but you get nice long fibres when you're on there. And then to make it even more spiky and leggy, just use the dubbing needle to tease those fibres out. By putting quite a lot of fur on it, being generous, it means you can tease them out without getting bald bits. After a few fish though, it tends to get a bit chewed and a bit bold. But I think part of the appeal of this fly is to have that nice leggy, scruffy appearance at the front.
Impressive timing.
You can neaten it up a bit. I mean, if you put too much on, you can take these fibres off, but don't be afraid for it to look a bit scruffy.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so thanks Dave for time super selection of flies.
Pleasure.
Inspiring,
Pleasure.
yeah, very entertaining. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.